Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with you. I think the same way they do in the NFL, where there's a lot of regulations they need to go through and a lot of clearance that they need to go through medically for them to compete. Because like you said, they're performing at these exceeding levels that um it's crazy enough to believe that race car drivers and people that operate was it jet planes and all those, they actually experience the same type of thing, which is jet fuel or G-force. I'm sorry, and that's a brutal thing to handle on your body. So rest and recovery is always perfect.
Yeah. And I'm probably going to get some people that'll say, but Doug, you've never raced in NASCAR. What are you to say about this? And I'm like, my thoughts are that something very similar happened to me in my go-karting days. In my championship season in 2013, many years ago, when I was driving in K1 and all that, there was one race that I missed willingly, although luckily it was an exhibition race because, otherwise I probably wouldn't be the champion that year. But I got sick with like a simple cold when I was racing that year, and I missed an exhibition race out in Apache Junction, and I did that willingly because I knew that with where I was at, especially with the soda addiction and the obesity, I could not afford to even drive one of those vehicles because it's very unsafe. When you drive any sort of vehicle, it's not even an if and or buts about it. And you don't have to be an athlete because, driving when you're sick is not safe. It's a safety hazard. And, even though Kyle Busch did not crash while he was racing while sick and everything, he endangered himself a little bit, I think, in doing so. Although, again, it's no one's fault and we're not here to point fingers, but it's simple common sense that if you get sick, the best thing to do is to let your body rest. And, I think that this is a hard lesson for a lot of people that, we need to not only be graceful to ourselves when we have to sit out, but we have to keep an eye on our bodies because infection can come anytime, anytime. And so, that's why I missed that race in K1 was because I knew I had to let my body rest.
No, I mean 100%. I think and again, I'm gonna take it back, to an athlete's perspective and take him. He was a seasoned veteran in this industry, and for him to still have that ambition to go out and do another race, incredible at his age.
Yeah.
It just shows the level of athleticism mentally that he had to say, okay, I know that I'm beaten down, but let me do one more race. You see that rarely in a lot of people nowadays. We have very few.
Yeah. Did you find it very interesting that Kyle Busch's last victory lane words to the world before he died was literally, you never know when your last one is, because you probably saw how he won the truck race for Spire and then he hugged his young son Brexton when he came up to congratulate his father. And then when he spoke to the reporter, he said, you never know when your last win's going to be. And then it was later that he was gone. It's like, whoa.
I'm almost getting a little emotional. It's
Yeah.
because I think he knew, right? I think, I'm shedding a tear here, because I think he knew. And it's something that takes a mental toll on not just a person, but a man as well to kind of sit with that pain and say, I could disappear next week, and who knows? I don't know whether he truly know that, but it seems like in that video of watching him, it's like, yeah, he kind of knew that that was his last ride, but it's
Yeah.
yeah,
I
it's
mean, I'm sure that Kyle probably didn't know that he was going to die, but it wouldn't surprise me if he probably, with how sick he was becoming, it wouldn't surprise me if he thought that that was probably going to end his season at least, or at the very least be a sign that he might needed to retire because in the year and about the year leading up to this year, Kyle was contemplating retirement so that he could help Brexton get to the Cup Series eventually, potentially anyway, from what it appeared. And Kyle was riding in his fi and like he was riding for Richard Childress's team in the number 8 car, which he had won a couple of races for Childress after he departed from the 18 M&M's car with Joe Gibbs, but he was virtually uncompetitive in his final couple of years, aside from just picking up occasional top tens and all that. And you might know, but Richard Childress's team is now a 2 car team in the Cup Series, when at one point they were like 4 to 5 cars, I think. And then Childress's team has not really been the same since Dale Earnhardt died, but it's overall been a competitive team. It's just Childress's team now wins races than wins championships, really. And so Kyle was probably going to ride out of his Cup Series career with Childress. And then, sadly, Richard Childress had to deal with the devastation of losing 2 drivers. Because, Richard, when he hired Kyle, he said that he saw the same thing of Dale and Kyle. And in a lot of ways, Dale and Kyle had a lot in common because they were aggressive drivers. They wanted to win. They were not hesitant to not have a filter and to tell people blunt realities, and all that.
Yep.
And, both Dale and Kyle had their fair share of controversies. Like, Dale Earnhardt had a history of the bump and runs, although in his case, Dale ran into guys in a way that was legal and still won, which is why that's why people were amused about Dale is, he would cheat, but he would cheat in a way that was legal. You know what I mean?
Right.
And in Kyle Busch's case, it was the same thing, although Kyle Busch was also a little bit polarizing because he had sort of an arrogant attitude. Both Kurt and Kyle Busch, because, Kurt was a great driver as well when he was racing. And Kurt Busch was one of the most unpopular drivers in NASCAR in the early odds, around the time that Dale had passed away. And, Kurt had his demons, but in Kyle Busch's case, he also had some demons, but it was mostly entitlement rather than just being mean. So, but Kyle had also his fair share of controversies as well, such as almost committing career suicide when he wrecked Ron Hornaday Jr. blatantly intentionally. Did you hear about that?
I did. It was out of the blue. It was a very arrogant thing. It was an interesting thing to watch. So yeah, to me it flipped me the wrong way.
Yeah, I was that year of 2011, before I get to that, one of my best memories with Kyle Busch that I remember when I first got into the sport of racing, and this is something I'm going to look fondly on forever, was Richmond in 2011. I had seen Kyle Busch win at Bristol in 2011 when he was dominating Bristol and all that, although I had also seen clips before about his wins in 2010 and 9 and all that. 2011 is when I became a huge full-on fan of Kyle Busch because he won Bristol in 2011 in what was a very
Mhm.
competitive year for him. And then at Richmond in 2011 in April, he qualified, I think he qualified like mid-pack or something, if I'm recalling right. So he seemed like sort of a long shot for victory. And, that was a race, I think, where Juan Pablo Montoya, I believe, was up front. And it looked like Juan was going to have a chance at winning his first oval race. But Kyle Busch quickly showed right away when the race began that he was the guy to beat because all it took was like 50 to 100 laps, I think, or so for him to get to the top 10. And then, if I recall right, after a pit stop on like lap 130 or something like that, somewhere between there, the first pit stop anyway, Kyle took
Yeah.
the lead, and from then on, it was a very overwhelmingly dominant victory, and that showed how skilled he was because he just took the lead and he just ran away with that 400 lap race from then on to the point where I knew by the time it was like halfway in the race, I knew Kyle Busch was going to win. Like there was no question about it, because every time he came onto pit road, he always exited first. He never lost the lead pretty much for the rest of that night. And it was just, I think he led like over half the race that day, but it was once he got to the lead on like lap 100 something, whatever it was it was obvious he was going to win. And that was when I became a Kyle Busch fan for life. And then I saw him win the inaugural race at Kentucky, although it was television, of course, that year. But other than the Phoenix races, it was just television that I saw him. Then he won the inaugural Kentucky Cup race. And then Then, unfortunately, his year was shadowed by his feud with Kevin Harvick that went on for a while, and then the Kevin Harvick feud spilled over into Ron Hornaday's season because Ron Hornaday drove for Kevin Harvick at that time, and Ron and Kyle overall had a respectful relationship up until really that point because they were both Ron Hornaday was a veteran that had raced since literally the 1980s, and Kyle was like the new guy, one of the new guys in the sport, although he had been racing for like a few years before 2011. So it was a veteran versus a young rookie scenario. I saw the Texas truck race on television because I was pulling for Kyle during the final parts of that year because his team, Kyle Busch Motorsports, was on its way to a potential win in the owners truck series standings against Kevin Harvick Incorporated. And then the Texas race happened. And then on lap 11, I saw the wreck with Ron Hornaday. And I remember, despite being a huge fan of Kyle Busch, I remember being like, when I saw the crash happen on television, I was like, because I knew that what Kyle had done was wrong, and I was like, really, you had to end your championship owner hopes with for the season with that, you know what I mean? Because in the replay, it showed that Ron didn't make an egregious move. It was just a racing deal. They were just looking for the same real estate and all that, and I just, yeah, I mean, we're not here to speak ill of the dead, but I remember seeing that race and being like, you had to mess up your championship year over that. You know what I mean? And I just, it was almost career suicide for Kyle. But luckily he bounced back from that because I think the Ron Hornaday deal was what caused him to turn a corner.
Yeah, I agree. With regards to a lot of those drivers. I mean, again, the early 2000s of NASCAR was brutal. It was ornery. It was dirty. It was dirty. And you're seeing what you're describing is what modern day call goats. They were the goats of NASCAR. A lot of these guys gripped it and ripped it and really run around the corner like it was their last. And we see a lot of that today, but I think to permanently etch Kyle Busch into the record of like ambition of like the NFL, the Patriots winning back to back. It's that similar um um complex that he had. So yeah, I mean, hats off to those guys because they gripped it and ripped it.